this meeting to order. I think we'll start out with just an introduction of those members of the city or county commission who are actually present. And then maybe Nicole, you can share those who are joining us online, or they can step in and do that as well, and then also staff. So if we could start with Dan down on the end down there.
That camera?
Yes, shout it out.
City Commission, Daniel Brooks.
City Commission, Trina White.
City Commission, Greg McCall.
And also with the city commission, Michael Larson.
And I'm Nicole Cromwell. I'm the zoning coordinator. I will be helping the commission this evening with the public hearing and presentations. Troy Boucher, who's the chair of the county zoning commission, is joining us on Zoom. However, we do not have a quorum of the county zoning commission this evening. So we might have to do a redo of this presentation for the county zoning commission in the future. But we will continue with the presentation for the city zoning commission this evening.
Okay, well, thank you. Anyone else you needed to introduce? Yes, we have Monica Plecker, who is running our Zoom meeting. She's planning division manager. Our planning director, Wyatt Friday, is in the audience. We have Jeanette Beek, who's going to be with us to help check people in at the senior center. And then Robin Bartley, who is our planning clerk this evening, is going to take the minutes and answer phone calls for people who want to call in comments at 237-6165. And, no, wait a minute, that's 237-6120. We have too many numbers. And I forgot to mention that Jack King, our zoning commission member, is also joining us on Zoom this evening. Thank you, Nicole. At this time, I would give the opportunity for any public comment on any item that is not on the agenda. My call-in number again was 237-6120. That's anything not on the agenda this evening. Seeing no response, I will go through briefly just the order or the rules. We will have a presentation by staff on the section of the code that we are looking at tonight. Then an opportunity for any of the commission members to ask staff any questions. I will then call for an opportunity for members of the public, starting with those who are here in attendance, going to those who are either calling in or some other form of communication, and that should wrap it up. Is that Nicole? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to share the presentation on the screen. And we're going to do a slideshow. In a moment, it'll work. Okay, and then I have to do this. Okay. So this evening we are taking 3 sections of the code that are common and have very common requirements between the city and the county, and that is landscaping, off-street parking, and proportionate compliance. In May of 2019, the county took the lead on the landscaping changes in their code and have already adopted the new landscaping requirements. But off-street parking and proportionate compliance are both new to the city and the county. So first, foundations. The foundation of all our work in Project Recode has been the 2016 City of Billings Growth Policy, the 2016 Lockwood Growth Policy in the county, and then the 2008 Growth Policy for the rest of Yellowstone County. So that's where we started. And those guidelines, goals, and policies are what this new zoning code is built on. When we started this project 3.5 years ago in June of 2017, the City County Planning Board adopted a steering committee, and they appointed 18 community members to guide this process. And that steering committee developed a set of guiding principles for staff and the working groups and the planning consultant team to work and visualize this new zoning code, and those are outlined on the screen. So we tried to clarify and simplify zoning wherever we could. We wanted to focus our efforts on regulating things that mattered to our community, as stated in those growth policies. We wanted to make sure we were protecting and preserving the rights of owners and residents. We were trying to prevent conflicts wherever we could in the new zoning, but we wanted to provide options and context for every new development. So we're not saying this is the only way you can develop. We gave options where we needed to, and you'll see that in tonight's presentation. We also wanted to maintain districts and areas that we really cared about and were really exemplified the character of Billings. We knew we had some spaces and gaps in the code where we didn't regulate things that people were doing in the community. So we had to fill that void. And last but not least, we wanted to make sure that we were working towards the prosperity of Billings and Yellowstone County by supporting those financial businesses that support how we live, work, and play in this area. So as an introduction, we're just going to jump right in to landscaping. So landscaping right now in the city has 6 different, or 7, depending how you count, codes that depend on where your property is located. And then it has a variable and sometimes formulaic standard of providing landscaping when you do a new development. So those are the standard landscaping code, which applies in many of the zone districts throughout the community. We have the East Billings Urban Renewal District has its own landscaping standard that was adopted in 2012. And that was meant to support the redevelopment of the East Billings District as we tried to breathe new life into that area. We have the entryway zones, and those districts had more of a formulaic standard for landscaping, and those were adopted in I think it was the early 90s for the interchange areas around Billings and Yellowstone County. The medical corridor has its own landscaping standard, as does the South 27th Street Corridor District. And then finally, the overlay districts of the North and South Shiloh Corridor also have a permit point-based system for landscaping requirements. And as I said at the beginning, the county got ahead of us in the city on landscaping and worked through this point-based system before the city did, and already adopted it in May of 2019. And we're going to make sure that it's incorporated into this whole new set of codes, and make some errors, corrections, things like that in the county zoning code, but it's essentially staying the same as was adopted in 2019. So, first and foremost, in both the county already adopted code and the city code is the requirement and focus on the provision of street trees along frontage for new development. We found during the growth policy updates in 2016 that this was a primary comment we got from a lot of neighborhoods and communities, that there weren't enough trees along the streets to make walking a pleasant experience. So the landscaping working group put this down as first and foremost. It's not part of the point system. It's just a requirement of every new development that goes in the city or the county. Now in the county,
They said every 50 feet of frontage. So if you have small frontage, 50 feet or less, it's one tree, and you have to plant it within so many feet of the front property line for it to count as street frontage landscaping. The city said, no, we would like to do one every 40 feet. So that's what they have proposed. The downtown district, we had a lively discussion with the Downtown Business Alliance, and they thought that one every 25 feet was important downtown because of the amount of asphalt and concrete and buildings they have. There is no other landscaping other than street frontage landscaping downtown. So it was agreed that one every 25 feet, generally in the public right-of-way, would be appropriate. Now, street trees provide many beneficial benefits to the community. Some of them financial, some of them aesthetic, some of them things that are, you can't really value or put a dollar price to, but they do add marketability to property. They reduce heating and cooling costs for buildings. They pull particulate pollution out of the air. They reduce wind and evaporation off of grass and lawns. And it's estimated, and these are just estimates, that the annual net benefit of a mature large tree in someone's yard is about $129. And then a public tree is about $172 of public benefits to the community for each street tree. And it's the only type of city or county infrastructure that increases in value over time. Everything else is depreciated. This is appreciated, and not just by the people who live next to it, but by people who walk under street trees. So that's a big focus of the new landscaping code and a requirement. The buffer yards, which is the properties adjacent to each other, depending on their uses, is where we really applied the new point-based system. And there are 4 basic buffer yards. B is really just to distinguish or demarcate where properties change in large areas of the same use. So for example, areas south of King Avenue West, where there's a lot of contractor-based businesses and large parcels like 5 or 6 or 8 acres, that along those property lines that are similar uses, that we'd still want to have or establish some trees. And so that's 1 tree per every 70 feet and drip irrigation to those trees. The B1 is really just to more formally announce the property boundary, and sometimes it can be between very similar uses, but maybe different intensities. The B2 is a filtered screen. They're not really incompatible uses, but they need some sort of screening from each other. And then the B3 buffer yard is the full screen between uses, where you would, an industrial use next to a residential use. So fencing is required in those districts. This is kind of busy on the screen, but it's available online. This is a chart that we developed to say, okay, here's the required buffer yards. Here are the zone district categories, 1 through 5, and the different uses that could happen in those zone districts. And so your proposed new development is, you read down the columns for that. The existing adjacent development, you read across. So for example, single family next to single family requires no buffer yard at all. If you're going to, unless you're a heavy commercial or an industrial use, you don't need to provide a buffer yard adjacent to an open space. So the X's demarcate where no buffer yard is required, and then each of those other locations have the B1, B2, B3, or just B in the chart. In East Billings Urban Renewal District, we decided that that landscaping standard was so specialized for that form-based district that we left it alone. It's still in that part of the code. It's not incorporated into this point-based system. And that's the city chart. Now, the county chart, a lot less busy. So there's no landscaping required in agricultural uses next to any agricultural zones. It's also not required in rural residential zone districts unless that rural residential zone district is saying, you know, you're putting in a single family next to an existing multifamily development, then you would provide a buffer yard on your side of the property line. Also, that's one of the things that's a little different about this point-based system is that it's not just for the new development. It's, if somebody comes in next to an existing development, they're providing a buffer on their side of the property line. It's not up to the existing development to provide any buffer on their side of the line, unless, of course, they redevelop, and then they provide additional buffer on their side. So the point-based system is based on getting a minimum number of points for each buffer yard type to get approval. You use the chart to determine what kind of buffer yard you need. And then the minimum number of points is in this chart, and the minimum width of that buffer yard is shown in the chart as well. So the B1 buffer yard is a minimum average width of 6 feet. And because it is narrow, we're not, the landscaping working group decided that turf grass would not be a permitted use in that very narrow buffer yard. So it's listed as not permitted. The other, you need to get 0.3 points per linear foot to get approval. There's no minimum tree points, but a third of those points need to be in plants or shrubs or perennials or some other living material. There's a maximum non-organic landscape material of 25%. So in other words, you know, something that was never living. So we don't say living material, it's just non-organic material is 25% maximum. So you could have rock, but it's 25% maximum in each one of the buffer yard types. So as you go up, as the buffer yards get more opaque and more screening required, the higher the points you need to get. So in B2, you have to get a certain number of tree points, and you have to get a certain number of plant or shrub points, as well as a required screen fence in the buffer yard 3. So can't really see on here, but this next chart tells you how many points that you gain from each type of either plant or square footage of landscape material. So for example, a large existing retained tree that has an 8-inch diameter trunk or larger could get you 27 points. If you retained that tree and it was in good condition and was in the right area of the property, then you do get points for retaining those trees. So that was another goal of the working group, was to retain existing mature landscape where it made sense and to allow points to be gained for that. Now, perennials and ground covers in annual beds are 17 points per 500 square feet. And then we gave less points for lawn grass or turf grass, and that's per 1,000 square feet. We also gave points for other materials typically used in landscape areas such as ornamental pavers, organic mulch, screening fences, split rail fences, boulders, seating, and even public amenities, depending on what those amenities are. So here's an example of a B1 buffer yard. You're building a multifamily residential development. It's next to a single-family residential existing neighborhood. You have 120 feet of shared property line that the B1 buffer yard has to go in. And that buffer yard, based on that linear feet of shared property boundary, requires 36 points. And 12 of those points have to be in shrubs, plants, or perennials. So your buffer yard is 6 feet in average width, so a total of 720 square feet of landscape area. So because of the number of choices that are allowed and the points allowed for each choice, you could do this. I just quickly came up with 3 different ways of doing this. You could do an annual flower bed and then a split rail fence along the property line. And that would, that's well over the required number of 36 points. This is actually 41 points. You could do perennials and shrubs again, and then add 2 trees, and that's again well over the minimum required points. That is 43 points. Or you could do the minimum number of points, and the way you do that is you just do 352 square feet of perennials and shrubs, 2 landscape boulders, and then 2 5-foot park benches. And that gets you to the minimum number of 36 points for that buffer yard. So there are, as I said, bonus points for retaining natural vegetation, including mature trees. So there's probably 20 ways to meet the buffer yard points just in this one example. And every buffer yard has the ability to develop a unique and appropriate for the context planting and landscaping in a buffer yard. The next part of the landscaping code deals with parking lot landscape. And the landscaping working group thought that there should just be a standard across the board for landscaping in parking lots. And it's not no landscaping, and it's not too much landscaping. It makes sense for most of the parking lots that we develop in Billings and Yellowstone County. And that is that parking stalls need to be within 132 lineal feet of a landscaped island, or about every 12 spaces. You should have a landscaped area. That those terminal islands on rows of parking have to be at least 9 feet wide, but 4 feet shorter than the parking stall that it's adjacent to. And that's to make sure that people don't run over the ends of those islands like they do in many parking lots and just destroy the irrigation or destroy the landscaping. I don't care how tall that curbing is, they're going to run over it if it's the full length of that adjacent parking stall. That if parking lots have more than 100 spaces, they should be broken up with landscaped strips. So there's, a maximum of 50 spaces on one part of a parking lot before you start on another part of a parking lot. That every landscape island have at least 1 tree. And that if you're doing a landscape strip for those bigger parking lots, that there's 1 tree every 40 feet in those landscape strips. Water conservation design is encouraged in this landscaping code, particularly in parking lots, allowing people to use what they call rain gardens or reverse guttering, so that landscape strips don't necessarily have to get all their water from irrigation. They can get it from stormwater runoff. Snow storage is going to be required in new parking lots, but you can use parking lot landscaping as part of that snow storage strategy. particularly where you're using water conservation design. So this is just an example of how a parking lot would lay out, showing the terminal islands, and then there's center islands, so that on a linear foot basis, you're not having 50 or 60 or 70 spaces in a parking row before you have some landscape relief. This will really cut down on the stormwater problems in some parking lots. It will shade areas and preserve, amazingly enough, asphalt degrades in sunlight. And the shady parts of parking lots are the parts of the asphalt that last the longest. So this is really a cost-saving measure overall. So, which takes a segue right into off-street parking. The current city off-street parking code is not in zoning. We discussed this with the city engineering division at the beginning of Project Recode, and they said, okay, let's try putting parking back into zoning. In 1985, the city council took off-street parking out of the city zoning code and put it in the building code. So now we're going to put it back in the zoning code because it's more related to land use than it is to engineering codes. The engineering division is still going to keep the construction specification requirements in their code so that they will be reviewing underlayment, stormwater design, striping, asphalt thickness, curbing, all of that. And we will, in zoning, be administering the parking ratio requirements based on land uses. The county off-street parking code has never been in a different code. It's always been in zoning for the county. But those parking ratios in the county's off-street parking code are pre-1971 parking ratios, and the uses are so general as to be not useful anymore when trying to figure out whether it's compliant with parking or not. So we've updated those parking ratios. We've expanded the list of uses so we're capturing enough detail into those charts. The city code only that we're allowing offsets for transit and will require most mixed-use zones to provide at least one bike parking rack on a property. So that'll just be a thing we do from now on. The city and county zoning codes will both allow some offsets for on-street parking for neighborhood adjacent businesses. So if it's on a corner of a street that goes into a neighborhood and they have 4 on-street spaces on that adjacent street that are on their side of the street, not down into the neighborhood, they can count those on-street spaces against the off-street number they're required to provide. So that's a little bit of offset we're going for. In the city code only, not in the county, we're setting a maximum off-street parking ratio. So that would be, something different. We've never said, no, you can't have 1,200 parking spaces at the mall. We've never said that to anyone. They just make the parking lot as big as they want to. This code is saying, we think we've got the parking ratios right, and we're going to let you go beyond that to a certain percentage, but not beyond that point. And if you do want to go beyond that point, then administratively you have to ask to go above that maximum ratio. And if you do, then we will require additional landscaping provided on the property and some other things to mitigate that max oversized or king-sized parking lot. We're going to continue the no off-street parking provisions in eBird and the Central Business District zones. So those exist right now. We're just going to continue those into the future. The electric vehicle charging stations will be allowed in any parking structure and on any parking lot where people want to provide that for private parking. Okay, so here's an example of exceeding the maximum. I'm not sure if you can see this on the screen very well from where you're sitting or watching, but the left-hand photo is the Rimrock Mall and the old Kmart, and that was in July of 2015. So you can see that maybe about 15 to 20% of the parking spaces in July, 5 years ago, were in use. Just this past year in mid-May 2020, same piece of property, the only parking available or open at the time was in front of Winco because the mall was closed. So it's not really a good example, but it shows you that even during a good business time, the mall really exceeds their required parking by quite a bit. They have tried to build some businesses on those outlying parking spaces so that they can start to better use their property, but it's just one example of exceeding the maximum. Which takes us into proportionate compliance. So when we talk about landscaping and off-street parking, and these are different types of codes from the existing codes, we're going to have properties that won't comply or be fully in compliance with these new requirements. But we didn't want to put them wholly in the basket of a non-conforming use or a non-conforming site characteristic and put all of the restrictions on that property that non-conforming designation comes with. So part of the working group's idea was to let's figure out a way to trigger gradual compliance over time, especially for these, I guess, what you call softer elements of development, so landscaping, off-street parking primarily, but there are other requirements in there that could apply to. So as a property gets redeveloped or added onto, the current code for landscaping says if you're expanding by more 25% or more of the gross floor area of your building, or 25% or more of the required parking, you have to meet 100% of the landscaping code requirements. That has pushed some people in the direction of, I'm going to do 24% additions to my property, and I will never have to do any landscaping, which is the way that code works right now. So we've seen that. That's happened. So also the current off-street parking code says you don't have to provide additional spaces if those additional spaces equal 10% of or less of what's already on the property. So you get a lot of like gradual increases in intensity of a commercial development and parking required for it that eventually you're well beyond being slightly out of compliance, you're well beyond being compliant at that point. So that's what the current kind of very structured code results in. So we said, okay, let's look at how we can bring people along gradually as they're doing improvements to their property and they're investing in the community. Let's make sure that those gradual improvements also gradually bring them into compliance with especially landscaping and parking. So when we built this new proportionate compliance code, we said, let's have a look back provision in there saying it's a 5-year window. So when you come in for, let's say, a 10% increase in your building, and that doesn't really trigger anything to happen at that point, but then you come in 3 years later and you do a 40% or a 15% increase in your building. At that point we say, no, it's time to start working on compliance with landscaping and parking at that point because we have the ability to look back. 5 years, not 10, but 5, to say, let's bring this up a little closer to what the code requires. And, oops. I forgot to change that last slide. I'm going to leave it there. And ask if you have any questions that I can answer with those 3 code sections. We covered a lot, but I think getting 6 landscapes codes down to 1 for the city is probably going to cause a lot of questions. I know it's a lot of math. Since we've adopted the code for the county, we spent a lot of time, Dave Green, who's a planner in our office, as well as myself and a few other people, have spent some time with landscape architects who are doing county projects, going through the math and figuring out what are the options that they have. Because they're very used to these formula type codes that says you will do X, Y, and Z. There is no X1 or X2 or X3. There's only one. So it's a learning process.
Questions?
Nicole, Tina, and I do have some questions.
Tina, can you hold your comments until the board is finished with their
I'm
questions?
sorry, certainly. Thank you.
Sure.
Again, questions from any members of the commission?
I don't have any questions.
Who got their hand up first?
Go ahead.
You
Okay,
can go
grab
down.
the mic and turn it on. I think I didn't turn it on.
It looks like it's on.
Is it green?
Test. Oh, no, it might be muted. There we go, okay. This is my first look at the landscaping draft. So forgive me, Nicole, because there's probably more in here than I was just trying to flip through it as you were kind of giving the high-level stuff. But I guess I'm a little confused on the point structure system. I'm really confused on it, and I think it'll just take some time to kind of work through it a little bit and practice it. But are there going to be, or was there any intention of having any more figures to kind of be descriptive? Like figure 27-1200, things along those lines that could be. It feels like there's a lot of graph and a lot of charts, and it'd be nice to have a few more examples plopped in there. I don't know, is the team considering anything additional to that, or is this kind of where we're landing, do you think?
Well, I think it's where we're landing. We do have the charts, which consolidates a lot of words into less. As we haven't done a lot of examples of, like here's the B1 buffer yard done this way.
And that's my point, I guess. Like if we look back at the other zoning districts, like N1, N2, N3, we made a point to make sure that we had some examples in there to kind of illustrate.
Right.
And I think
Right.
that's just an opportunity here that could maybe make it a little less, maybe a little easier, a little less mathematic. Just some
Right.
examples. We could end up with all the exact same buffer yards, but hey.
Well, I will tell you that the plant list and recommendations are not going to be part of the zoning, but they will be an appendix that we use kind of offline. They're not formally adopted. In other words, we can change those and amend those and put graphics like you're talking about in there. It's like, here's an example of a B1 buffer yard. Here's an example of a B3 buffer yard. But as I said, there are so many ways to meet those minimum point requirements. I would hate that people would say, oh, that's the only way to do it.
Sure.
Look at the picture and say, oh, that's the B1, and not think of a different way of doing it. So I hesitate to put it in the code, but we could certainly develop some over time from examples and put them in the appendix as examples.
That'd be fine. I think that's not a bad idea, because it's mine.
I do agree. It's complicated. The landscaping working group worked for 2 years on this, 26 pages of code. So they did a lot of background and research and reviewing and editing and tweaking the points and making sure they got it right that way. So
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Nicole. That kind of answers my question. I was just kind of curious. You had said earlier when we were talking about the tree or frontage and having taken input from a number of our different areas of town, I was just kind of curious if we did have a working group really tweaking these numbers and variables, and so I'm glad to hear that. That was kind of my broader question, and then more of a specific one. We've got on here listed public amenities, and see section B, floor B. I'm not sure exactly where that is, but can you just give some examples of what those amenities would look like?
Sure. Well, some of those are listed in here. So public art, for example, it truly has to be public art, and it includes things like fountains and clocks and murals, outdoor seating plaza that's open to the public, that has a sheltering structure for people to sit in the shade. A pedestrian paths that connect residential development to an existing development where people may want to go for a neighborhood amenity or business service, that sort of thing. Or just adding to a public walkway system that exists on an adjacent lot, bringing it through their own development. So those are the types of public amenities. Now, when those are proposed, they have to go through both the planning department, but as well as the engineering staff who manages the public rights of way, especially, you know, in particular, if it's going to be in a public right of way, it has to be approved all the way through the system before it's allowed to be included as a point in the landscaping plan.
Thank you.
Additional questions? Do we have anyone online or on the county or otherwise?
I think Tina Volek had some questions, and if I could get the microphone.
And I had a question.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to ask about the parking lot at Albertsons on 12th and Grand Avenue.
12th and Grand, okay.
I've had people tell me like it's so like mixed up, and so it's not a very easy parking lot to get in and get, I mean, the way the islands are, it's been engineered or whatever. So is that parking lot and the number of spaces, trees, etc.? It's a very tough parking lot to get in and out of.
Right. Some of that has to do with the turning radiuses that were provided from the drive approaches off the street, as well as the turning radius around the ends of those islands. So people really have to swing around.
Yep.
To get into the drive aisles between the parking spaces. And the drive aisles, I think, are just minimum width drive aisles. So larger vehicles, pickup trucks, you know, you have a kind of a hard time backing out and not hitting somebody behind you. So it certainly could use a redesign that way. I'm not sure if it would meet the minimum landscaping requirements for parking lots in this code. It doesn't have terminal islands all along the front.
No.
And it's a misconception that many people have, is that there has to be a driving lane across the front of a building. That is an old fire code requirement that is no more. You can park right up to the pedestrian access into the building. You don't have to leave a driving lane along the front of a building. So, you know, that's another thing that could, you know, benefit this particular location, is not make the driving lane across the front of the building, that the driving lane is pulled back halfway down the parking lot and you drive through the middle of the parking lot instead of across the front of the building.
Okay.
It makes it safer, but you know, it takes a lot for a developer to invest in an existing parking lot. There has to be some great amount of failure of the asphalt, or new user who comes in and just demos half the building and takes over. And so you have to redesign the parking to accommodate that new user.
Right.
So, but incrementally, you could bring that along.
Gotcha.
Okay, Tina had some questions.
Yeah.
On
Yes,
Zoom.
also a
So
comment,
crazy.
and I do want to say I'm speaking for myself alone and no other group. First of all, I think proportionate compliance is an excellent idea. And I commend the staff and the committee that worked on it for coming up with it. I think it solves a lot of issues that have been a problem for the city over the years and are actually detrimental to the concept of renovating things. So I think it's a very solid approach. Questions I have first involve trees, the street trees. Are they, and I'll just ask my questions and then get off and let you guys answer them, unless you have something back for me. Are street trees then the property of the property owner or of the city, and who is responsible for their maintenance and replacement? And I say that in light of having lived in the Kansas City area when Dutch elm disease came through, and so much of their street tree stock was in Dutch elm. It was really devastating. The other question I have is about, well, two more actually. The second question I have in regard to trees is, what happens in neighborhoods, for example? I'm used to them being between the street and the sidewalk, and the picture you showed is a sample of that. What happens in neighborhoods where there are no sidewalks, or where the sidewalks, as in Ironwood, for example, are paths behind the building? So those are my street tree questions. And then when it comes to the not the setbacks, but the buffer zones, if a person or if a builder developer makes a choice on a buffer zone, is that how it will be set up permanently? So if I put in, I think one example was putting in plant flowers and then and a fence. If I decide the flowers are too much for me to maintain, can I come back to you guys and change it? And what comments, if any, will adjoining neighbors have? As you know, we've had an issue out here with a new development that backs with a bar and some other facilities that backs up on a neighborhood. Would, in that kind of case, a neighborhood have the ability to comment on what's being proposed? And those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay. I'll hand the mic back to you. So I don't want to get cross-talking. Okay, so street trees, in the code, it's expected that outside of the downtown area, many trees would go on the private property inside the sidewalk, although they could be, if allowed by the city engineering division, they could be planted in that boulevard between the sidewalk and the curb. As you know, we do now require in new developments that sidewalks are provided as boulevard sidewalks in most every development. And so we do have that planting area between the sidewalk and the curbing. In the draft code, trees don't need to be spaced exactly according to 40-foot intervals or 50-foot intervals. It's where they will fit along the street frontage. And even in places where street trees are planted in the public right-of-way, in the boulevard, for example, the adjacent property owner is the responsible party for taking care of those. Although the city engineering division does oversee what happens to those trees that are planted in the boulevard, such if you want to replace one or trim one up or take one down. So wherever they're planted, behind the sidewalk or in the boulevard, they are the responsibility of the adjacent landowner. As far as, we do have a recommended list of street trees depending on what's happening in that particular area. So we have street trees that are intended to be planted underneath overhead utility lines, for example, that don't get so tall that they interfere with those utility lines. We have other types of trees where there are no overhead utilities, but maybe there's something happening underneath the ground that you can't plant all types of trees. In addition, certain types of trees are not going to be allowed as street trees because they are invasive or they go for our city water or sewer pipes and break them up. So those are not going to be on the approved street tree list. Let's see, what was your second question on the street trees?
Well, about if you don't have, for example.
Oh, you don't have a sidewalk.
Or a sidewalk, yes.
Right. Then it would just be within the front yard of the property, even if there is no sidewalk. A lot of, I haven't been out to Ironwood for a number of years, but I know that many neighborhood streets that don't have sidewalks have people walking on the street, generally on the edge of the street, or sometimes using the whole street, depending on how much traffic there is. So street trees can be useful in those areas as well. Then you had a question on, oh, okay, so you have, yes, you gave the example of the Hawk Creek Lane project out there west of 54th, and having adjacent neighbors give input on proposed buffer yards between those two types of uses. And in general, landscaping is part of the permit review, which is ministerial and administrative review. It's not a public review necessarily. That particular zoning there is a planned development zone, and there was very specific landscaping that was written into that planned development because of its adjacency to that neighborhood of Cottonwood Grove. But we believe that the B3 buffer yard, which is going to be required between those really intense commercial uses and any adjacent residential uses, will be sufficient, regardless of how it's put together and what options are chosen, to buffer those adjacent residential uses and neighborhoods. We probably didn't get the chart absolutely 100% right, and we are definitely going to be watching as we put this code through its paces after it's adopted, so that if there's something wrong, if some quirk is not working right, then we will go back in a year or so and bring a host of housekeeping amendments to the City Council to correct those errors and fix those issues that we encounter in the first year or two of the new code. And
the other question I had, thank you, was in regard to once you've selected a buffer type, you gave an example of 3 or 4 different ways you could approach an issue. Is that then, I hate to use the phrase set in stone, but is that a permanent decision, or may you change them, and is that an administrative decision?
You do have to live what you get approved with until you change your mind, and you can bring back a modification to your landscape plan at any time. If you decide you don't like annuals, or the new owner doesn't like annuals and they want to plant trees and shrubs, you certainly do that. We just need to get a new landscaping plan of record and make sure it meets the minimum point requirements for that buffer yard. And then that goes of record on the property and continues forward. Right now, it's very difficult to track compliance with the submitted and approved landscaping plans. And this will allow us to be better stewards of those plans that have been approved to make sure that they're staying with the course and their landscaping installations. And it is administrative.
Thank you very much for your help.
Sure.
So I did have to check, did everybody, did they hear what the question was? The answer, okay, good.
Okay.
So do we have anyone else, Zoom, et cetera?
Or on the phone, 237-6120.
And also an opportunity now for those in attendance, if you have any comments or questions.
Right?
I have a question, a comment and a question. My name's Kara Gibran and I'm here in Billings at 933 Yale. And I just want to say I'm really impressed by this. It represents a lot of work and I think it's a great start. I would like to admit, I don't know how this would be done. It might be too difficult, but I would like to see some priority for native, xeric, or pollinator-friendly plantings. And I wonder if that could be incorporated into the point scale somehow, or if that will just be on an approved list of plants. I would like to see those given some sort of preference or top billing or something like that. So I don't know if that can be done, but that would be my question. How that could be done.
I think that we absolutely can pull those plant choices up to the tops of the lists. We do give more points for native or naturalized plantings than for non-naturalized plantings. We'll probably see those being employed in the larger buffer areas and the larger point requirements. But we certainly can pull those up to the top of the recommended plant list that we have started and keep adding to.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Again, additional questions, comments?
No.
Members out here on the phone? Anything else from staff?
I guess I've got a question again about, on the buffer yards, I'm having a hard time finding where the required points for each buffer are located in the code. You made mention that you need 35 points, and where am I?
Yeah.
So in the chart on the next page is the standard buffer yard types. And then there's a certain number of points per linear foot that are required for the whole buffer yard.
Okay, I have that chart. Yeah, we don't have that in our packet.
Oh,
Okay, good. That's all right. Thanks.
it's page 10 of the public review
Oh.
draft. I'm sorry.
I think we're missing.
Yeah,
We're
we
missing
are.
9 and 10.
Okay.
Okay,
I was just like, this just doesn't make
Like,
sense.
what's happening? Yeah.
Okay.
okay, a
Eight.
misprint. My gosh,
I think we're
okay.
missing
Oh, you're right, yeah.
8,
Sure, go ahead, take it.
9, and 10. That's 10, so 8 and 9.
Yeah, so this is what it looks like. So like,
I was wondering.
planting minimum speed,
Oh,
610.
oh,
Then we need total points required per linear foot.
okay.
So yeah,
Okay.
yours skips page 10. I'm
Okay.
sorry about that.
No, that makes more sense. I was just like,
What else?
yeah.
We don't have 8 either.
Oh
Page
dear.
8.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay,
Okay.
it's all right. That makes more sense now.
So it's project-recode.com/code-outline. That's the real thing.
That's the real thing.
Okay.
Okay.
Any additional questions, comments from anyone concerned? And if that, seeing none, that will conclude our business for tonight.
Right. And please join us again tomorrow
We'll be back
evening.
tomorrow, same time, same place.
Right, where we will tackle signs and nonconformities. Because signs and nonconformities, because those two things go together.
Okay, non-conforming signs.
Apparently.
Yes,
Okay, all right, with that, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you,
thank you.
Chair.
Did you do parking? Was I asleep?